welcome to this video. Now, essentially, this is my Christmas gift to my community, to my viewers and to soon to be my viewers. This is an explanation, a tutorial, if you will, on how to deal with refunds in Stripe in programming way. Obviously, it's quite easy to do that in the dashboard of Stripe. You can do it manually quite easily. You find the transaction, you do the refund, whatever kind of refund you want, you provide the reason and all that, and you may also have disputes and you can handle that in the dashboard. But sometimes you may want to do that in a programming language. In this case, it's going to be C# programming language. We'll sort of take the implementation of a checkout that I teach at my Stripe course. You can take a look at my Stripe course as well. Also, if you don't care for this intro, feel free to skip it. Now, we'll take a look at how you can handle the refund of a checkout session, okay? Refund of that checkout experience for your customers. So we will retrieve the payments. I'll show you where they should be sort of retrieved, and then I will show you how the whole refund arrangement should work, what data you need to have and what data you can access just from simple ID and ID of something, and I will obviously show you of what the ID is. It is a bit of a complicated arrangement, but I will explain everything to you. It will be quite simple to understand, and as usual, Stripe is not too difficult to handle, but it will be an API. It will be accessed via Postman. We won't build some kind of a dashboard, some kind of a client. It will just be a simple API dealing with refunds of Stripe checkouts, Stripe purchases via the Stripe checkout. And with all that said, let's get into some action. First of all, we will take a look at the project itself. Actually, 3 projects we have in this whole arrangement. And the project, actually, the main project rather, comes from my Stripe course. It's the Stripe checkout example. You can actually access this code in the Patreon, in my Patreon, and you'll find all the other source codes as well. But you can also get my Stripe course and you will learn how to implement that Stripe checkout experience. Now, for the purposes of refunds and explaining how to use them, it is a bit modified than what you would see in my Stripe checkout lectures in my Stripe course, but it still is kind of the same arrangement. Now, I'm not going to get into any of that checkout experience part. It just exists for the purposes of getting basically a payment record into our database, and then from the database we will retrieve the values and we will try to refund the values. It's kind of an interesting arrangement, but let's take a look. We have right here 3 projects. First of all, we have the Blazor example. We won't take a look at that. It's just basically the front end for that whole checkout example. Okay, and then we have this API. Now, API contains the whole checkout experience, and we now have refunds, right? We have refunds. So some things are in the controller and some things are in the payments. Okay, so we have a refund controller right here, and I'll explain to you everything. But the most important thing here is our payments table. Okay, we have the SQL Server project. That's right, it's a SQL Server project. It's a great thing. You can publish it to any database. It's a great thing to have a SQL Server project rather than write your SQL databases or whatever it is inside the server itself. It's best to have a project like this. And in this case, the important part is payments table. Now, if I get into that, into the actual table right here, let's take a look at what it has. First of all, it has ID, which we all need, and the ID will be client reference ID, which is in the checkout experience. It's in this checkout session, but it's not accessible in a way that we could reference to retrieve the data for that session. It's impossible to do that. Hence, we need something else. And that something else, in this case, we need checkout session ID. Now, once you have checkout session ID, you can access any part of that checkout experience of that purchase, basically. You can get the payment intent, you can get the charge, you can get all these different things. But you do need to actually have this. Just having the ID, which will be client reference ID, for that experience is not enough. So this is basically the addition that was added onto the basic example of Stripe checkouts. Okay, so we have a value paid, product ID, status, just some basic placeholders basically these are. And then we have date created. Now we have another thing right here because we are basing it on our own database. We take payments from our own database. The only interaction we do with Stripe itself is the actual refund for the actual charge. So we handle it all on our own database, then we refund it on the Stripe. So you'll see how that works, and we will actually access these pieces of APIs via the Postman. You can also take a look at my Postman course if you're not sure what Postman is. It's a great tool, and my course will get you started extremely quickly with all that. Now, we can take a look at one of the stored procedures. The other one is just to insert the payment, basically payment record. But we have insert new payment. Okay, so that inserts, and then we have update payment record status. Now there are a few more of them, and I will show you everything as we go along later. So now let's take a look at the code and let's see basically how we actually retrieve this piece of data. Now then, at this point you may see a lot of things running, and yes indeed, there are many things running on this computer because we need to test everything, we need to go through the whole experience. So for the checkout experience you need to use the Stripe CLI, which basically redirects your webhooks in one way or the other. There are many preferences there, and basically they redirect to your local host. Very, very useful and great thing to have. Now, I do show how to use this thing in the Stripe course. You can take a look at that. But for now, we'll need to create a new payment for this checkout experience inside Blazor. And you can take a look at my Blazor course as well. If you're not familiar with Blazor, it's definitely something worth your time to get started with. So let's do $7. Okay, let's do $7. I tested this yesterday and I did 5, so let's just separate that a bit and let's do 7. So once you click pay, you'll get redirected to the Stripe checkout experience. And once you get to the experience, you need to enter the test card details. You must enter these specific details provided by Stripe. You can find this in the description, and you basically copy that, and I'll show you how you insert that just in case you don't know. You get back to this Stripe checkout, a very nice experience which you can actually modify. You can modify this experience to your maybe theme colors and things like that, and you can add your logo right here instead of this just generic one. Okay, so basically you enter a random email. Okay, a random email. Let's do test@tester. Oh, a little typo, doesn't really matter. It's just a random email, doesn't actually get sent anywhere. Okay, and then we paste our test details. Now, whenever you handle anything payments related, and especially if you are going to handle refunds, you always want to test the other cards provided as well. Probably with all of them, with all the scenarios with which they may fail, because they may fail and they will fail, and you have to have some certain safeguards in certain places and sections of these arrangements. So as for the date, you just enter any date in the future. Okay, any date in the future, and CVC is just a random 3-digit number. Okay, and then we can enter the name, let's say test, let's do tester like that. And then you click page 7 and it will go through our little experience, which you can find in my Stripe course. At this point, we can retrieve the payment and look at how the whole payment is retrieved, or rather how payments are retrieved in this whole arrangement. It is relatively straightforward, but there are a few interesting things that I've done here, and I think they might actually be quite useful. First of all, if we look at Postman right here, this is how we retrieve it. We have date from and we have date to. We have our route in the API, which I'll soon explain. And then we have these values, but these values are not just simple dates, as you can see. Now, this is actually a tick, something called a tick. And you can convert a tick, or rather a date to a tick, in any programming language, sort of generic value. And that's why I implemented this. Now, you would probably use some kind of a C# front end, and sending those dates through these parameters probably would not be a real issue. But when it comes to dates, when it comes to date formats, it can be an issue. It can be an extremely annoying issue. So to avoid it altogether, this is what you can do. You can simply send it as ticks. Okay, send it as ticks, and then you can convert it on your backend, and that's it. And then, as you can see, we retrieve a list of successful payments. So these are payments that were successful. This is what we retrieve. But again, at this point, we are still only dealing with our own database. And as I mentioned before, we will only get to the Stripe part of things once we actually need to do the refund. So let's take a look at how this whole arrangement works of retrieving the payments. And you can see right here in the code, we are now in the code. This is what's called refunds controller in our example API. Okay, we have refund, which we will look at later, and we have retrieve payments. So we retrieve payments, which is a list of full payment records. We already have a payment record, sort of payment record for the checkout experience, which you can take a look at in my Stripe course. And we use these models very quickly, very easily, especially when you go to from Blazor to API, and from API to Blazor, it all converts smoothly, and it's just a great thing. Very little code to actually write. But as you can see right here, we have date from, and we have date to. And these are long. Ticks are long, okay? They have to be long. You can't just have an integer, you have to be long when it comes to ticks. And we input as parameters in this method, we input an actual date. So you just construct a new date time from those ticks, and that's all there is to it. Now I'll show you something quickly. If you want to look up the method in question, you can simply go to definition like that, and we already have it opened, right? A little shortcut. But this is where we retrieve the payment. Okay, we have date from, date to, and to retrieve it we use get successful payments. Okay, get successful payments, which is a stored procedure. So we are using a stored procedure from SQL Server, a very simple arrangement, a very straightforward arrangement in my opinion. And you can customize it as much as you want to. Basically, you're just retrieving payments from your own database using your own code. There's no third-party interference at this point, right? There's no third party at all. You are handling your own thing. So chances are fewer things will break, and fewer things will break in the long run when things will get updated. When you need to update something, you will not need to update this arrangement. Say, for example, if the Stripe API gets updated, right? If the Stripe library here gets updated, You will need to update certain parts, but you will not need to update the retrieval of payments part. You will not need to do anything at all, because this is simply your C# code and your SQL Server arrangement, and that's it. So as I always say, keep it as free of third parties as possible. You do not need that many third parties everywhere. Okay, so we have this get successful payments. We provide two parameters into the stored procedure, and we can take a look at the stored procedure. Right here, it takes date time, date from, and date to. And this says successful payments. Now, our successful payments are with status 1. So we have where date created more than date from, right? Date created more than date from makes sense, and date created less than date to makes sense as well. And finally, we have status 1. Now, one thing about these date created things, okay? You see right here, we have date created, right? This is a value in the database, in the table. And that is more than date from. And then the second statement is date created less than date to. What happens here, and what you should follow here, you see the first value is always from the table. It's always in the same place, okay? So in this statement, it is more than date from, and then in this statement, it is less than date to. This way, it's a lot easier to do it, and chances are that you won't get lost with it. So do be a bit structural when you have two statements as a sort of one statement like that. And other than that, we have a whole list of data that we are retrieving. And you might ask, why don't I just have the whole thing as one thing? Okay, I could just have it like that, okay? Like that, and I will retrieve every piece of this whole thing. But in that case, I wouldn't really know the order of them. And this is again the same thing. You should always keep the same order. Okay, you have ID, value paid, product ID, status, and all that. And then if we go back to payments right here, you see we retrieve it in the same order. We have ID, value paid, product ID, status. And if we go down in the payment record, you can see it's the same thing. ID, value paid, product ID, status, date created, owner, checkout, session ID. It's all in the same order. Always do it in the same order. That way you won't get lost. And if you do get lost, if you retrieve integer into a string, that can be very, very troublesome and quite annoying to actually solve those issues. So keep the same order and you won't get lost. Very simple. Okay. And as you can see, the output is a list of payment records. So this is what we actually output. And we retrieve it in Postman. Now we are back in Postman. And as you can see, the ID is used for client reference ID. So we can't use that for the refund. We need something else. And that something else is the checkout session ID, which gets inserted in the hook. Okay, once the session is complete and successful, we take it from the hook. We update the status, and also we update this column in the table, right? This value, checkout session ID. We update that and we insert this test record. And once we have this checkout session ID, obviously you would probably have some kind of an interface. You would not do this via the Postman, although it is actually possible, as you can see right here. It is quite possible to do it via Postman. There is probably an issue with that, but it is possible nonetheless. So once we have the ID, we can actually get to our next test, which is the actual refund. Okay, now that's the actual refund. See the route, and we provide session ID. So from the session ID, we will establish the refund. And now we can take a look how the refund itself works. So let's look at our final thing and the most important thing probably in this whole arrangement. and that would be the actual refund, okay, the actual refund. So we have session ID as the query parameter, okay, going in through a refund route, and we return a string, which could be anything else. Actually, it doesn't have to be a string. You have all the information in the world to return to the client. You can be a bit more creative than that, but for example purposes I thought it would be fine. Now we have Stripe configuration as usual. API key is set, okay. API key comes from the environment variable, which is actually very important because you want to have your variables set up properly. You want to have test variables in the test environments and live variables in the live environments. It is extremely important when handling payments. You have to have these environments as separate as possible and as properly set up as it is possible. Now then, we have the API key set as with anything with Stripe, and as with anything with Stripe, we need to use the Stripe library, okay, latest version preferably, as latest as possible. And just like anything else with Stripe, we need to use service, okay. So you construct a service, as you can see in this case it's a session service. Now it might be another service as you will see later, but in this case it's session service. And then from the session service you can retrieve or create or insert or modify or do different things associated with that particular item or that particular section of the Stripe API. In this case it's the session, okay. So we get specific session by the session ID. This is a checkout session, okay. So we get the session. Now in the end what we need is the charge ID, okay. We don't need payment intent, we don't need session ID. We only need the charge ID, okay. We only need the charge ID because that is what we are refunding. So it is a bit of a road towards that. Now in theory you could insert all these different things, say when the checkout goes through, right? You could insert all these different IDs and all that, but you don't really want to overcrowd your database as well. There's no point in doing that. Now, if you only have 100 transactions or 1,000 transactions maybe, it's all fine and good to have maybe more data collected, but if you have a lot more transactions, then maybe it will overcrowd the database and the cost will be a bit more significant, and there's really no need for that. As long as you have the session ID, you can retrieve anything else you want to know about that session, the charges, payment intents, customers, clients, and all that. You don't need to keep it all in your own database, but you do need that reference point, which is the session ID. Now, mind you, we have, once we retrieve the session, we actually have some more data in the session. And it does actually contain a charge, okay? It does contain a charge. Unfortunately, the charge is null, okay? It's null. Rather, it's charges, not charge. And it's all null, so you won't be able to access and you'll get an error. What you need to do, as you can see right here, we need refund options. So we set up refund options right away. And we set the charge. Now the charge, we first get ourselves a payment intent service, okay? And from there, we use get, okay, to get the payment intent with that particular payment intent ID. Now, payment intent object will contain a list of charges, and we presume that in this case we only have one charge in that list. Now, you might have a few more charges, so you would want to probably loop it or do your own thing according to your own arrangements, but the presumption in this example is that we're only dealing with a single charge, a sort of a single basic payment. That's why we just take element at 0 and we take the ID. Now, mind you, this says charge, but it's actually an ID. It requires the charge ID in the refund create options. Okay, refund options, refund create options. Okay. And then we need the third service, right? That's the refund service. I'll actually turn off a breakpoint. We have a refund service and we have create. So we provide create refund options. That's what it takes. And it does its own thing. Now, it can succeed and it can fail. Right, a refund can fail, it can succeed, it can do many different things. But if it is successful, the refund status will be succeeded. And that's what you need to check for. Now, it's a simple string, so you check it as the string. And you do have to test this quite a lot. Okay, you do have to test this extensively. Now, if you do just a basic checkout experience, which you can take a look at my course, you can also find subscriptions checkout, how you can set up subscriptions in Stripe using Stripe, and not only in the code, but manually in the Stripe dashboard. You can find all that in my course. But if you do that checkout experience, maybe you don't need to test as much, but once you start dealing with the actual API in this kind of a fashion, you have to test it extensively, insanely extensively. You have to. There's no other way around it. And as you can see, Stripe library is actually very easy to use. It's quite well made. You get a service. From the service, you get some kind of an object, okay? Or you insert some kind of an object rather. And to create something, you have options. So you have options, you have services, and you have different objects. Now, each and every object may not contain all the data that the object is set up to contain. So you do have to be careful about that as well. Like, for example, session will have many different things. If I get into that a bit, I can do session, okay, and let's say I find something like charges or customers, wherever it may be. Actually, I'll go into payment intent and I'll go to charges. And you think this would work, but actually this is null. Okay, it's null, so it won't work. It's absolutely pointless. You have to retrieve it. So you do have to be careful about these things, but this library in general, I believe, is one of the best third-party libraries that you can actually go ahead and integrate. There's no comparison with, say, PayPal, which is absolutely terrible. So this is how you can handle payments in C#, in .NET Core API, in .NET 5 API. You can take a look at my .NET Core or .NET 5 API development course as well as my Blazor course. They are all on discount in this Christmas period, and they are also on a good price in general. And of course, take a look at my Stripe course, implementing Stripe in Blazor and APIs. Do subscribe to this channel, and if you want to find the source code for this whole arrangement and for the checkout experience, do support this channel on Patreon. All the source code is available for my Patreon members.